At exactly 3:07 a.m., Kang Min-jae realized something was wrong. The house was too quiet. His wife wasn't home. And the strange part? This wasn't the first time. For years, he had everything under control. The city feared him. His enemies obeyed him. Nothing moved without his permission. But inside his own home, there was a woman he never truly saw. She used to wait for him every single night. Amara would sit in silence, long after midnight, listening for the sound of his footsteps, hoping, just once, he would look at her, speak to her, notice her. But he never did. To Kang Min-jae, she wasn't a partner. She was a responsibility, a quiet presence, something that simply existed. So slowly, she stopped trying, stopped waiting, stopped speaking, stopped hoping. And the most dangerous part? He didn't notice until she started coming home late. At first midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m., and now 3:07 a.m. The same woman who once waited for him was no longer there. And for the first time in his life, Kang Min-jae felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not control, but uncertainty. Because the one person who never left him was now living a life he knew nothing about. Where was she going? Who was she becoming? And why? Did she no longer need him? He controlled the entire city without fear. But now, he couldn't even control what was happening in his own marriage. So one night, he decided to follow her. And that decision would destroy everything he thought he owned.
The next morning, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the mansion, soft and golden, touching every polished surface like perfection lived there. The staff moved quietly, efficiently. Breakfast was prepared on time. The house was calm, controlled. From the outside, it was the kind of life people envied. Kang Min-jae sat at the head of the long dining table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His presence as sharp and composed as ever. Across from him, Amara sat in silence, her posture straight, her expression calm. To anyone watching, they looked like a powerful couple. Untouchable. Complete. But the silence between them wasn't peaceful. It was empty. Min-jae didn't look at her. His attention stayed on his phone, occasionally scrolling, occasionally replying. Important messages. Important people. Important matters. Everything except her. Amara didn't speak. She didn't ask how his night was. She didn't ask where he had been. She already knew the answer didn't include her. Once she would have tried. She would have dressed carefully, choosing something she thought he might notice. She would have stayed up, rehearsing simple conversations in her mind, anything to keep him at the table just a little longer. But those days were gone. Now she simply lifted her cup of tea, her movements quiet, controlled. She had learned how to exist without disturbing anything. Min-jae finally stood up, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'll be late tonight," he said flatly. No explanation. No pause. Just information. Amara nodded once. "Okay." That was all. No disappointment. No curiosity. No reaction. And somehow, that should have meant nothing. But something about it lingered. Min-jae hesitated for half a second. Not enough to be noticed, not enough to matter. Then he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoing faintly through the hall. The door closed behind him. And just like that, the house felt different. Amara remained seated for a moment, staring at the untouched food in front of her. Then slowly she pushed the plate aside. She wasn't hungry. Not for food. Not anymore. The silence wrapped around her again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. Felt familiar. Safe even. She stood up, walking toward the large window. Outside, the world moved freely. Cars passing, people going somewhere, living something. For a long time, she had believed her life was inside this house. Inside this marriage. Inside him. But now, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But quietly. Irreversibly. Later that evening, the mansion remained just as perfect. Lights glowing. Staff moving. everything in place. Except one thing. Amara wasn't there. And for the first time, her absence didn't feel like loneliness. Felt like choice. There was a time when Amara believed love could be built quietly. Not with grand gestures. Not with loud declarations. But with patience. She remembered the early days of their marriage. The way everything felt unfamiliar, yet full of possibility. The mansion had seemed too large then, the silence too heavy. But she told herself it was only temporary. Love, she believed, would grow into the space. So she tried. Every night she waited. First it was simple. She would sit in the living room, the soft ticking of the clock keeping her company as the hours stretched. She would glance at the door every few minutes, her heart lifting at every distant sound. When Min-jae finally returned, she would stand, smoothing her dress, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Welcome back." Sometimes he nodded. Most times he walked past. Still she stayed. She told herself he was busy. Important. A man like him carried weight others couldn't understand. His silence wasn't rejection, it was responsibility. At least, that's what she chose to believe. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Her efforts became quieter, more careful. She learned his routines. The way he preferred things arranged. The timing of his departures. The silence he seemed to favor. She adjusted herself around him. Until there was almost nothing left that was just hers. Even her voice began to fade. Where she once tried to start conversations, she now chose her words carefully. Fewer questions. Shorter answers. Less presence. Not because she didn't care, but because caring alone was never enough. Still, hope is a stubborn thing. It lingers even when it shouldn't. There were nights she convinced herself things were changing. Small moments that meant nothing, but she held on to them anyway. The way he paused slightly at the doorway. The rare glance in her direction. Once he even asked if she had eaten. It wasn't much. But to her it felt like everything. So she held on longer than she should have. She stayed in the spaces he never filled. Waited in moments he never shared. Loved in ways he never returned. Until waiting became part of her identity. Until silence became her language. Until hope became exhausting. The night she realized it, nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No harsh words. Just silence. She had been sitting there again just like always. The lights dim. Clock moving slowly. Waiting. But this time, something felt different. Not heavier. Not sadder. Just clear. She looked at the door. And for the first time, she didn't expect it to open. The realization settled quietly within her. He wasn't coming for her. Not emotionally. Not truly. Maybe he never had. And suddenly, all the nights she had spent waiting felt distant. Like they belonged to someone else. Someone softer. Someone who believed love could grow on its own. Amara exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't in a long time. Then she stood up, turned off the lights, and walked away from the door. That night, she didn't wait. Kang Min-jae had built his life on one principle. Never look back. Not at mistakes. Not at people. Not at anything that threatened control. To him, the past was a weakness. Emotions were distractions. And attachments. Dangerous. Everything in his world had a purpose. Function. Place. And once something fulfilled its role, he moved on. That was how he became who he was. Feared. Respected. Untouchable. His days were precise, structured down to the minute. Meetings, decisions, movements. Nothing left to chance. Men twice his age lowered their voices around him. Rivals chose silence over confrontation. Power followed him naturally. Because he never hesitated. Never questioned. Never allowed himself to feel more than necessary. Even in his own home. That same discipline remained. Amara was part of his life the way everything else was. Stable. Present. Uncomplicated. She never argued. Never demanded. Never disrupted the order he had created. To Min-jae that was peace. He didn't see the silence as absence. He saw it as balance. There was no reason to look closer. No reason to question what was already working. If she didn't speak, it meant she understood. If she didn't complain, it meant she was satisfied. If she stayed, it meant she belonged. That was enough. More than enough. Love in his mind wasn't something that needed expression. It wasn't in words or attention or presence. It was in provision. The house, the security, the life he gave her. Everything she had came from him. And in his world that meant everything. What more could she possibly need? So he never asked. Never paused long enough to notice the spaces between them growing wider. Never saw the way her presence softened. Then faded. Because Min-jae didn't look for what he wasn't losing. And in his mind, he wasn't losing anything. Every night he left the house the same way. Without explanation. Without hesitation. And every night, he returned expecting it to be exactly as he left it. Quiet, unchanged. That was how control worked. Nothing moved unless he allowed it. Nothing shifted unless he decided. That certainty had never failed him. Not in business. Not in power. Not in life. So he carried it into his marriage without question. Without doubt. Without fear. Because the idea that something could change, without his permission, had never crossed his mind. Not once. And that was his greatest blind spot. Not arrogance. Not cruelty. But certainty. The kind that makes a man believe he sees everything. When in reality, he has already stopped looking. The night everything changed didn't announce itself. There were no raised voices. No breaking glass. No moment anyone would remember as dramatic. It arrived quietly. Like every other night before it. Amara sat in the living room. The soft glow of the lamp resting against her skin. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second stretching into the next. Outside, the city moved on without her. Cars passing, distant sounds fading into silence. She had prepared dinner hours ago. It sat untouched, cold, waiting. Just like her. She didn't check the time anymore. She didn't need to. Her body had learned the pattern. The long hours. The silence. The absence. Still she stayed. Because somewhere deep inside her, something hadn't let go yet. Quiet. Fragile. Persistent. She told herself the same thing she always did. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he would come earlier. Maybe he would sit down. Maybe he would see her. The sound of a car passing made her glance toward the door. Then silence again. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair. And then, something shifted. Not outside. Inside. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity. Slow, steady, undeniable. Amara looked around the room. The perfectly arranged furniture, the untouched table, the stillness that had become her world. And for the first time, she saw it clearly. Nothing here was waiting for her. She had been the one waiting. For something that had never truly been coming. Her chest rose slowly as she took a breath, deeper than usual. The weight she had carried for so long didn't disappear, but it loosened. Just enough. Her eyes moved back to the door. She stared at it for a long moment. And then, she looked away. That was the moment. Silent. Invisible to anyone else. But final. Amara stood up. Not slowly. Not hesitantly. Just done. She walked past the dining table without touching it. Past the space where she used to sit. Past the place where she had spent so many nights hoping for something that never arrived. Her steps didn't echo the same way anymore. They felt lighter. Freer. She reached the hallway, paused only briefly, then continued toward her room. There was no rush, no confusion, just a quiet decision settling into place. Later that night the front door opened. Kang Min-jae stepped inside. His presence filling the space as it always did. His eyes moved instinctively across the room. The table, the chairs, the stillness. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything except one thing. Amara wasn't there. He didn't stop. Didn't question it. just walked past as he always did. Unaware that somewhere in the same house, a woman who had waited for him for years had finally stopped. The first night she left, no one noticed. The house moved the same way it always did. Quiet, controlled, untouched by anything that didn't belong. The staff completed their duties. The lights dimmed at the usual hour. The doors remained closed. And Amara walked out. Not in secrecy. Not in fear. But with a calm that felt unfamiliar. She stepped into the night without looking back, the cool air brushing against her skin as if reminding her that the world existed beyond those walls. For a moment, she stood still at the entrance, her eyes adjusting, not just to the darkness but to something else. Freedom. It didn't feel dramatic. Felt simple. She moved forward. That night, she returned just before midnight. The house was still. Silent. Unchanged. Min-jae wasn't home. Nothing questioned her absence. So she went to her room, closed the door and slept. The next night she left again. This time a little earlier. Her steps were steadier. More certain. The city greeted her differently now. Not as something distant she could only watch through glass, but as something she could walk through, breathe in, exist inside. Time moved differently outside the mansion. It didn't stretch. Flowed. When she returned it was later. Past midnight. Still no one asked. By the third night, her routine had already begun to shift. Dinner no longer mattered. Waiting no longer existed. The house became a place she passed through. Not something she lived in. And slowly, the nights grew longer. 1 a.m. Then 2 a.m. Each return quieter than the last. Each absence deeper. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't escape. It was something far more subtle. Amara was no longer organizing her life around someone who wasn't there. She was beginning to build something that was. Something her own. And with every passing night, something inside her changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her thoughts cleared. Her silence no longer felt heavy. It felt intentional. She didn't explain where she went. Didn't feel the need to. Because for the first time in a long time, her life wasn't centered around being seen by him. It was centered around seeing herself. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, nothing shifted. Min-jae continued his routine without interruption. Nights out. Late returns. Unquestioned authority over everything around him. If he noticed the slight changes, the untouched dinners, the quiet absence of her presence, he didn't linger on them. Because in his world, small things didn't matter. And Amara had always been quiet, unintrusive, easy to overlook. So the pattern continued, night after night, until absence became normal, until silence changed shape, until something invisible began to grow between them. Not distance, not yet, but something more dangerous. Indifference, turning into separation. And somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m., a woman who once waited was no longer waiting at all. It happened on a night that felt no different from the rest. Kang Min-jae returned later than usual, the city already asleep beneath a quiet, fading sky. His steps were steady as he entered the mansion, his presence cutting through the silence like it always did. Everything was in place. The lights dim. The air still. The house. Exactly as he expected. He loosened his tie slightly, walking further inside without a second thought. Routine. Unquestioned. Untouched. But then, something paused. Not his steps. His awareness. A small, almost unnoticeable shift. The silence felt different. Not heavier. Not louder. Just incomplete. Min-jae's eyes moved across the room more carefully this time. The dining table was untouched. No sign of a late meal. No trace of movement. That wasn't unusual. What was the absence of something he couldn't immediately name. He glanced toward the living room. Me. His gaze lingered for half a second longer than necessary. Then he looked away. It didn't matter. It shouldn't matter. He continued walking, his footsteps echoing faintly as he moved through the hall. The house responded the same way it always did. Silent, obedient, still. Until he reached the staircase. And stopped. Not intentionally. Just briefly. A thought, uninvited, crossed his mind. Where is she? It was a simple question. One that should have had a simple answer. She was always here. Always somewhere within these walls. Quiet. Present. Unchanging. That was how it had always been. Min-jae's eyes shifted toward the clock on the wall. 3:07 a.m. The numbers held his attention for a moment longer than they should have. He looked around again. This time more carefully. The silence pressed differently now. Not controlled. Not expected. Just empty. Amara wasn't in the living room. She wasn't in the dining area. And for the first time, he wasn't certain where she was. A faint crease formed between his brows, subtle but unfamiliar. Min-jae turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the corridor leading to her room. Closed door. No light. He stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound. No presence. Just silence. Real silence. Not the kind he controlled. The kind that existed without him. Something about it unsettled him. Not enough to name. Not enough to fully understand. But enough to notice. He reached for his phone instinctively, then stopped. There was no reason to call. No reason to question it. She was in the house. She had to be. That was how things worked. That was how they had always been. Min-jae lowered his hand slowly, his expression returning to its usual calm. Controlled. Certain. He turned away from the corridor and continued upstairs, each step deliberate, measured. But something had already shifted. A question had entered a space where there had never been one before. And questions had a way of growing. Later that night, long after he had entered his room, the front door opened quietly. Careful. Amara stepped inside, her movements light, almost effortless. She closed the door behind her, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the house she knew so well. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just walked forward, unaware that for the first time, Kang Min-jae had noticed her absence. And somewhere, deep beneath his control, something had begun to crack. The question didn't leave him. It followed him into the next day. And the one after. Quiet. Persistent. Unresolved. Kang Min-jae didn't like questions without answers. Especially not in his own house. First he ignored it. Dismissed it the same way he dismissed anything that didn't immediately matter. His routine remained unchanged. Meetings, decisions, control. The world still moved at his command. But something beneath that control had shifted. Small details began to surface. The untouched meals. The empty living room. The silence that no longer felt placed. And then the time. Always late. Always after midnight. 3 a.m. It repeated often enough to become a pattern. And patterns meant intention. Min-jae sat in his office one evening, the room dim except for the faint glow of the city outside. His fingers rested against the desk, still, but his mind wasn't. Where was she going? The question no longer felt optional. Felt necessary. Not out of concern, but control. Amara had never disrupted anything before. She had always been predictable. Easy to understand because she never required understanding. She was doing something without his knowledge. And that was unacceptable. Min-jae reached for his phone. This time he didn't stop. Find out where she goes at night. His voice was calm, direct, no emotion attached. On the other end there was no hesitation. Yes, sir. The line ended. And just like that, it began. He didn't call her, didn't ask questions, didn't confront. Because in his world, answers weren't requested. They were taken. That night, he returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, just as it had been every night. He walked through it slowly this time. His gaze more deliberate, more aware. Observing. Waiting. For the first time. He was the one noticing. Amara moved differently now. He saw it in the small things. The way she passed through the house without lingering. The way her presence no longer adjusted to his. The absence of expectation in her silence. It wasn't distance. It was detachment. And it unsettled him more than he expected. Still he said nothing. He watched. And when the time came, left. Calmly. Naturally. As if it had always been this way. Min-jae remained where he was. His eyes following the space she had just walked through. He checked the time. Again. Pattern. A decision. Not random. Not accidental. Intentional. His jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composure. There was only one explanation that made sense to him. There had to be someone else. Someone pulling her away. Someone giving her what she no longer sought from him. The thought settled in quickly. Firm. Logical. Controlled. Not emotional. Just clear. Because in his world people didn't change without reason. And reasons were always traceable. Outside, unseen, the investigation had already begun. Eyes watching. Movements tracked. Every step documented. And Min-jae waited. Not patiently, but precisely. For confirmation. For proof. For something he could control again. Because whatever was happening, he would find it. And when he did, he would end it. That was how his world worked. What he didn't know was that the truth waiting for him was not something he could destroy. The report arrived without delay. Clean. Precise. Detailed. Exactly the way Kang Min-jae expected. He sat in his office, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. His expression unreadable as he opened the file. Every movement inside it had been tracked. Every location noted. Every hour accounted for. There would be no gaps. No uncertainty. Only truth. His eyes moved steadily across the page. The first night. A location across the city. Quiet street. Small building. Not a hotel. Not private. Public. He continued. Second night. Same area. Same building. Longer stay. Later return. His fingers paused slightly against the paper. Then moved again. Third night. Fourth. Fifth. The pattern repeated. Consistent. Intentional. But something didn't fit. There were no names. No faces attached to her movements. No sign of a man. No hidden meetings. No secrecy. Mr. Min-jae's gaze sharpened, scanning the details again as if something might reveal itself the second time. But it didn't. Because there was nothing there to confirm what he had already decided. No betrayal. No deception. No one else. Only Amara. Going somewhere. Returning. Alone. For the first time since this began. His certainty faltered. Slowly. He closed the file, his fingers resting against it as silence filled the room. If not another man, then what? The question lingered longer than he liked. Because it didn't have an immediate answer. And answers were something he was used to having. That night, he didn't wait for another report. He followed. Not closely. Not recklessly. Carefully. Controlled. He watched from a distance as Amara stepped out of the car. Her movements calm, familiar in a way that unsettled him. She didn't look around. Didn't hesitate. Just walked inside the building like she belonged there. Min-jae remained where he was. His eyes fixed on the entrance for a moment longer. Then he stepped out. The space inside was nothing like what he expected. No secrecy. No dim corners. No hidden conversations. Just light. Open. Real. Voices filled the room. Not loud, not chaotic, but alive. People moved freely, speaking, laughing quietly, existing without tension. And in the middle of it, Amara. Min-jae stopped. For a moment he didn't move. Didn't think. Just looked. She was standing among them. Her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen before. There was no careful silence, no measured distance. No restraint. She was speaking. Not softly. Not cautiously. Freely. And then, she smiled. It wasn't small. It wasn't polite. It was real. The kind of smile that didn't ask for permission. Min-jae felt something shift sharply within him. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. Unfamiliar. Because the woman in front of him was not the one he knew, or thought he knew. She wasn't waiting. Wasn't quiet. Wasn't invisible. She was present. Alive in a way that had nothing to do with him. And that realization landed harder than anything he had prepared for. There was no betrayal here. No one to confront. No enemy to eliminate. Only a truth he couldn't control. Amara hadn't found someone else. She had found herself. And for the first time, Kang Min-jae understood something he had never considered before. He hadn't been replaced. He had been left behind. He didn't confront her that night. Kang Min-jae returned home before she did. The silence of the mansion closing around him like something unfamiliar. He stood in the living room longer than usual. His eyes resting on the space she used to occupy. Waiting. Not for control. For her. The realization unsettled him more than anything else had. Time passed slowly. For once he felt it. Every second stretching. Every minute noticeable. Until finally, the door opened. Careful. Unaware. Amara stepped inside, her presence calm, steady, untouched by the weight that filled the room. She closed the door behind her and turned. And stopped. Min-jae was standing there, watching her. Not moving. Not speaking. Just there. For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty. Not distant. But full. Of something that had never existed before. Awareness. "You've been going out," he said finally. His voice was controlled as always. But there was something beneath it. Something that didn't belong to certainty. Amara looked at him. Unshaken. Yes. No hesitation. No denial. Just truth. Min-jae studied her face, searching for something. Guilt, explanation, anything that would make this familiar again. He found none. "Where?" he asked. Simple question. But this time it didn't sound like an order. Amara held his gaze for a moment before answering. "Somewhere I can breathe." The words settled quietly between them. And for the first time, Min-jae didn't know what to say. He had faced men who feared him. Controlled situations others couldn't survive. But this was different. Because there was nothing to control. "You didn't tell me," he said. His voice lower now, less certain. Amara's expression didn't change. "You never asked." The truth landed without resistance. Clean. Direct. Final. Min-jae felt it. Not as anger. But as something heavier. Something that didn't move outward. But inward. "You've changed," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. Amara shook her head slightly. "No," she replied softly. "I stopped waiting." Silence followed. Longer this time. Deeper. Because there was nothing left to misunderstand. Min-jae's jaw tightened slightly. But not from control. From the absence of it. For the first time in his life. Power didn't give him an answer. Didn't give him direction. Didn't fix anything. Because this wasn't something he could command. Not loyalty. Not presence. Not love. "I gave you everything," he said, quieter now. Not defensive. Just searching. Amara's eyes softened slightly. But not with the same warmth he had ignored for years. "With everything you gave me," she said, "there was still nothing for me to feel." The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They stayed exactly where they were. And broke something he didn't know could break. Min-jae looked at her then. Not past her. Not through her. Her. Really seeing her. And realizing. He never had. The silence returned again. But this time. It wasn't empty. It was the sound of something ending. Or maybe. Something too late to begin. Amara stepped past him. Not slowly. Not defiantly. Just a moving forward. And Min-jae didn't stop her. Because for the first time, he understood something no power could change. He hadn't lost her in that moment. He had lost her long before he ever noticed.